Throughout their rich and storied history, the United States' Federal Bureau of Investigation has examined a multitude of frightening and unsettling crimes. But in the mid-1970s, the FBI was tasked with investigating a series of violent incidents that had captured the attention of the American public. It was a story of alleged brainwashing, militant politics, and innocence lost. It raised questions that have remained unanswered, even all these years later. This is the story of Patty Hearst. That's a snippet from the newest episode of my true crime channel, Saturn Soul. Be sure to go check it out and subscribe, link down below. Now enjoy the stories. In the late 80s, I worked on a remote cattle ranch in a certain U.S. state. As you can imagine, larger cattle ranches need round-the-clock security, and back then, that's how I made my living. It wasn't a glamorous job, and it usually wasn't very exciting, but I enjoyed it. During this incident, I was working night shifts. Previously, a worker who stayed in the on-site dorms had reported a trespasser on the grounds, but when security had investigated, they found no sign of anyone or anything. When I was doing my rounds that night, though, I was somewhat on alert because, in my experience, when there's smoke, there's fire. I was patrolling the area near the cattle sheds with one of the ranch dogs. The cattle sheds at night could be a pretty eerie place. They weren't noisy, really. The cattle were mostly bedded down or resting. There was just a sense of energy and buzz that came from being in proximity to so many living things, especially at night. I don't know how to explain it. I'm not a poet. The area just felt different. When I saw the man, I almost wasn't surprised. It's like I'd almost been expecting to see him. And to this day, I'm not sure what he was up to when I caught him. He was just kind of walking aimlessly around the area central to the cattle sheds. Immediately, it was obvious that he didn't belong, though, even from a distance. And how could I tell? Well, the fellow was wearing some kind of wolfskin costume. I flicked on my flashlight and called out to him, ready to release the dog if he ran. The guy just turned to face me. He stared down my flashlight, pointed right at him, didn't even squint. I came closer, hand resting on my gun holster, and the fellow looked me up and down like he was almost sizing me up. I didn't like the look of him one bit. His wolfskin costume wasn't some kind of cultural garb, nothing like that. Up close, you could see it was some kind of wolf rug or skin that he was wearing for whatever reason. Other than that, he looked like a typical regular guy from our state. Maybe not regular, he was fairly tall, well-built, and the man looked muscular enough to be a challenge, though. I told the guy to identify himself and to state his reason for being on private property. He wasn't intimidated at all, it seemed. He stepped forward, his wolfskin costume parting just enough to show the wicked-looking blade that hung looped from his belt buckle. Now my dog began to growl. The guy stepped forward and I told him not to move, and then repeated my question. The man did stop there, as I took my hand off my holster and instead moved to unleash the dog. Wolfman then threw his head back and let out some actual honest-to-God howl. And this caused the dog to get spooked, which was not usual for the ranch dogs. He pulled his leash free from my grip and just started running off into the night. And in that moment, I genuinely felt my heart drop. Thanks, buddy. Now it's just me and Mr. Wolfman. I honestly can't tell if this was just some sort of strange, elaborate prank, so I was kind of laughing. But after howling like a goddamn movie monster, now he's just looking at me with some type of sneer. Then he starts laughing, and I'm the dumbest MFer in the world for daring to ask who he is. It suddenly struck me that this guy was definitely mentally unwell, and maybe I should radio for some backup. And obviously, it's not a horror movie, so that's exactly what I did. I spoke into the radio and told my colleagues to notify the cops and then get down here. I never took my eyes off of him either, and he didn't move a step. He just stood there, challenging me, it seemed like. Now bear in mind how extra crazy this whole thing felt, because the guy was wrapped in a wolfskin rug, with a wolf's head just sort of sitting atop his own. I asked him a third time who he was and what he was doing on the ranch, and I guess something about this third prompting triggered him to action, because that's when he charged me. This guy went from standing there like a malicious wolf-clad clown to barreling straight at me like a fullback. The guy was on me before I even had time to react and actually draw my weapon. And I know, you probably think that I was bad at my job or had slow reaction times, but you weren't there. It was so sudden and so surprising. I do replay the incident in my head sometimes, trying to figure out if I could have reacted differently, but I don't think so. The guy was unpredictable, this aggressive fella, and people like that just behave exactly that way, unpredictably. He knocks me and sends me flying straight to the ground. Then this wolfman is on top of me, choking me out of all things. The goddamn wolfskin head is just staring into my face like some kind of dumb Halloween costume. I bucked and writhed, more affronted than anything else, and despite his size, I managed to throw the guy off of me pretty easily. I guess our scuffle had woken up some of the nearby cattle because now a commotion was starting to come from the barns. It was the sound of distressed and bothered cows mooing and stirring with alarm, and I cannot begin to describe just how strange and unsettling the incident was in that moment. There's this guy who's just decided to invade the ranch wearing a wolfskin rug, and he's attacking me, sure. And now the cows are all worked up and they're hollering and hooting. Then the dog, I guess he got his courage back because suddenly the dog comes running back, barking as well. And this caused the wolfman to back up momentarily, sizing the dog up. I was scrabbling across the floor at this point, just trying to get my bearings. The flashlight cast this very eerie beam on Wolfman, sending his wolf-clad silhouette across the barn wall. The dog was barking at him, and I kid you not, Wolfman was barking back, just howling and yapping at that darn dog like they were having some kind of argument. And the next thing I know, I hear shouts and running feet. One of my colleagues, his name is John, had shown up. And of course, he's more prepared than I was, and he's armed with a shotgun. And you'd think that seeing my shotgun-wielding buddy charging in, Wolfman would have backed down. Instead, it seemed like the commotion and action was only spurring him on, because he threw his head back and howls again. It was legitimately a full-throated howl, and it still sends chills down my back just thinking about how insane this guy was. I scrambled to my feet, ready to engage with this wolf guy. John wasn't hesitating though. He ran straight in and cracked Wolfman straight in the head with the butt of the shotgun. No stumbling, no stuttering, just a perfect action movie clonk right to this guy's head. This guy went down like a sack of potatoes, crumpled to the floor, pretty much unconscious. And by the time I reached them, John was fastening this wolfman's wrists with a plastic tie that he had with him. And now, long story short, the cops got there, and so did the owners and one of the managers. It turns out Wolfman was the deadbeat brother of said manager. He'd gotten into town, got completely blind drunk, and then decided to pay his brother a visit. When he sobered up a little, he revealed it wasn't even intended to be a violent visit. We were supposed to just accept and understand the fact that somewhere between making that decision and him arriving, he'd acquired a thirst for violence, a wolfskin rug, and a huge knife. It was a terrifying incident at the time, but I didn't mind the payoff and bonus that I got out of it, and nor did I mind that manager going out of his way to make sure that I got the best shifts and an actual pay raise. But I'll tell you what though, even with Brother Wolfman crawling back to where he came from the ranch, I still got a little unsettled when I was patrolling that area of the ranch at night. Seeing that lunatic charge me down in his wolfskin rug and hearing the wails of the cattle is a very sinister piece of imagery that honestly will stay with me forever. When I was a teenage boy, I lived with my sister, parents, and grandfather as neighbors to a large farm. My father was the foreman of the farm, so my family lived in a property on the grounds. This is a pretty upsetting story, and sharing it is hard, but I want people to understand. I'm not sure what I want them to understand. There's a lot that goes on in my head around this. There's the way people can change, and it's not their fault, I guess. I also want people to understand how dangerous farms can be. If you don't know what a threshing machine is, It's basically a machine that can sort and clean grain. They come in varying sizes, and they typically involve the grain being tossed inside a hatch into a set of rollers. These rollers are usually bladed and separate the grain from the stalk, be it wheat, corn, rice, etc. The farm we lived on had a number of threshing machines for the grain, and that's all you really need to know for backstory. None of us knew Papa was getting sick, least of all Papa, and it came without warning. It was a sickness of the brain, and you don't often get warned with something like that. Dementia, they call it. But it was like a curse from the devil himself, honestly. One day he was fine, and then the next, he wasn't so fine anymore. Papa had been slowing down in his old age, that much was true, but he still liked to go on walks around the farm grounds. That day I was with him. We were just talking casually about how school was going on and such, and the thresher machines were whirring nearby, so I don't think Papa could really hear me. It was just nice to talk to someone. Then Papa just froze and began pointing at me. He said something like I was there to kill him. He said that he wouldn't let himself be taken by me. I thought he was joking, although it was very out of character for Papa. He was a very serious, sedated man, though, and this was a sudden, violent outburst of screaming. And I barely had time to consider it before Papa grabbed me by the wrist and began dragging me toward the machinery. He was surprisingly strong for an old man, and I wasn't weak either, as a teenage guy who lived on a farm, but I didn't want to hurt Papa by struggling too much or knocking him back. That's why I initially underestimated him and was taken aback by his old man strength as he yanked me towards the thresher machines. Of course, it didn't help that he was yelling and screaming about how I was trying to kill him and how he would stop me. By the time I realized Pa had the strength of a man possessed, we were over by the thresher machines. Pa was screaming about how he wouldn't let me take him, how I was an agent of destruction. He was yelling all sorts of scary things that, in the moment, I just didn't understand. Looking back later, the event would simply just make me sad. And right then, though, it was downright terrifying. I tried to pull away from Pa. It scared me to notice how close we were to the threshers now. One false move and either Papa or I get a limb caught, or worse. I was conscious of my feet slipping against the ground as Papa tried to manhandle me. All the while, he was screaming. His voice was sounding more terrified now, like a part of him was aware of what he was doing and how bad of an idea it was. We were so close to the threshers that grain of wheat were pinging against me, and I knew I needed to get Pa away from those machines. I also knew that there was a real and genuine danger to my life if I didn't fight back. I was so worried about hurting the old man, though. I cried out, hoping someone else might see what was going on and step in. Why were the machines running without anyone supervising? In reality, the whole thing had played out in a matter of seconds. I just couldn't see that people were coming over to help. All I knew was that in the immediate moment, I was in severe danger of having my head forced into that thresher by my grandfather. Now Pa continued to scream about how he couldn't let me hurt him. He had to stop me. I was so close to the thresher that I could smell the oil. The din of the machine was filling my head, and dust and grit were making my eyes water. I could hardly see. I was going to die. Papa was going to die. Maybe both of us. With a Herculean effort, I grabbed Papa around the waist and lifted him up off the ground. I still have no idea how I was strong enough. Pa was an old man, but he wasn't small or frail. Not yet, at this point anyway. And I think it was like one of those stories you hear about with mothers lifting cars off their small children, only it was me lifting Pa away from that thresher machine. And by now I'd become more concerned with the old man falling into the machine than the idea of him forcing me in. I just wanted to get my Papa to safety, and we could work out why he was screaming and trying to kill me later. Pa did not like being manhandled, though, especially in his delusion that I was an aggressor trying to kill him. He thrashed in my arms, and I toppled backwards. Now quickly I let go of Pa and spun around, grabbing the side of the thresher machine and halting myself just inches from the spinning, rotating blades. And holy F, I had no time to relax, though. Pa grabbed my head from behind. He was trying to force my face into that thresher. Pa screamed in my ear. He yelled something about how I'd regret what I'd done, that I wouldn't take him too. I could feel the hot air from the machine against my cheek. The thresher was like some hungry, violent animal beneath me, and I suddenly remembered that the machine shared its name with some type of shark. Both of them were out for blood in that moment. And that's what crossed my mind, and that's what made me say no, screaming it. I kicked back from that thresher, sending Papa flying, and I no longer had the luxury of worrying about bruises or scrapes. I needed to get both of us away from that machine. Thankfully, Pa stumbled backward and I grabbed him again. I dragged him along the ground away from the thresher. I was shouting at him now, shouting that it was me, his grandson, shouting for him to get a grip on himself. People were finally running over too. My dad grabbing both of us in an embrace of generations at that point, and then things were just sort of this whirling blur of action. My sudden spike in adrenaline fizzled out then, and I just collapsed to the ground. Already I could see Pa had started to wander, looking confused. The expression on his face in that moment broke my heart, because that's when I knew. I knew what had gone wrong. I knew what had happened in his brain and that everything would change for him from here on in. He had a number of other lucid moments after this, but to me, this was one of the last times I saw Papa. He became something different after that. It's rare for dementia to suddenly manifest into violent moments like that, and from what we could gather, Pa believed that I was an enemy soldier from his time in the military. It's hard to be sure, though, because he was never really there after that. Pa sadly had to go into a home because of that manifested violence, and I found it very hard to visit him in there. I could remember the man he used to be, but I could also remember the man he'd been that day on the farm, when my own flesh and blood was trying to murder me because he saw me as a stranger. I'm one kid of many from a former farming family. We sold the business some years ago because local farming just isn't what it used to be. Far too hard to maintain, but I'll always have extremely happy memories of growing up on a farm. We worked hard, played well, got up at the crack of dawn, went to bed exhausted, and generally lived a solid, honest existence. Our family farm was a decently sized grain farm focused on various crops. At one point, we had lots of workers and lots of machinery. We also had a number of silos for storing the grain. Anyone who's visited farming country has probably seen them, or some variant. Squat metal cylinders that stood on stands, basically. We didn't have those really large, fancy ones that you see sometimes, but they had presence enough to be notable and very memorable. Now, I won't bore all of you by going into details of how grain silos work, but what you need to know is that they're essentially huge metal tubes, some tall as skyscrapers, and after a harvest, they're filled with grain that can be stored up, packed up, and shipped off to sell. Now, as kids, my family was strict about farm equipment, because it's farm equipment, you know? They had to be. You can't just play around with that kind of stuff. One single error of judgment and you just lost a hand or a leg or maybe your scalp. And so, here and there, as little kids, we'd get taken around the farm. This tour was usually by our mom, and we'd have to explain to her exactly what a machine was and why it was dangerous. And this is how she drummed it into our heads, scaring the bejesus out of us by having us talk about limbs being cut off and all sorts of things like that. But when we'd get to the grain silos, it was all very vague. Mom would stop and get very serious for a moment. You can't teach kids about danger if you make it too scary and serious. And we'd stand and look up at that metal silo. We'd say something like, "These are the grain silos and we don't climb up the ladders ever. If you fall in, you don't come out." And then Mom would hurry us away onto the next part of our tour, which I think was the thresher machines and all of the other random stuff. And then Mom would hurry us away onto the next part of the tour. Now, I'm not sure that any of me or my 5 siblings really thought about what it meant to fall into a grain silo at the time. To me, the danger was falling in when they were empty because, well, it'd be a huge fall. Way more than enough to kill you. And as a kid, I had no idea whether the grain silos were usually empty or full, so I just figured that was the danger most of the time. But how wrong I was. You see, falling into a grain silo when it's empty, sure, that'd probably kill you enough. A quick drop, a sudden death, just like any other high fall. Getting stuck in a grain silo when it's full of grain, though, Yeah, that's the actual danger. That's what had Mom so spooked and why we weren't to go anywhere near those silos. Anyone who grew up on a farm will know about this. There's all sorts of data about the ever-increasing reign of grain silo deaths. And around 15 years ago, there was a big to-do about changing the law so younger farm workers weren't even allowed access inside a grain silo. But that never went through in the end due to farmers protesting, I guess. And if you don't know, some grain farms require the workers to go inside the silos to walk down the grain, and it can be very dangerous. There are all sorts of laws about grain silos, and they differ from commercial farming and independent farming. Lots of differences, actually. And the only law we knew, though, was Mom's law. Us kids did not do any work around the grain silos. She just wasn't having it. Our dad never seemed too concerned, but Mom was the real power in our household. It was her family farm, after all, and our grandparents also agreed with her. The kids don't work in the silos ever. Not while I live and breathe, she said. And I would later find out that she actually meant that. She never wanted any of us kids to work in a grain silo, and she knew that it was important work that had to be done, but something about the silos spooked her. I guess maybe she had a bit of a woman's intuition, given what came next. One day, one of the farm workers, who held a relatively senior role, simply didn't show up to work. Rick had always been one of the most reliable men that you would ever know. Hadn't taken a sick day in all of his years on the farm. He was in his 50s, a beloved fixture around the farm, a favorite to everyone. Rick was our uncle, Mom's brother-in-law through marriage to her younger sister, our aunt. So when he simply didn't show up one day, it was kind of crazy unusual. Work carried on as normally as it could without him, but both Mom and Dad were super stressed at Rick's absence. They were talking about it nearby when my younger sister, Ella Beth, said something like, "Uncle Rick went into the grain silo." They questioned her on what she meant, and Ella Beth claimed that she saw Uncle Rick on top of the grain silo in the night when she was getting a glass of water. It was true that you could see the grain silo from that farmhouse kitchen, but why would Rick be on the farm overnight in the first place? Still, Dad went over to the silos and he and a worker checked. I was nearby and I was kind of nervous about Rick too, and nervous about my dad going into the silo, so I hung around to watch. I heard Dad shout out and I could tell something was wrong immediately. By late afternoon, Rick's body had been recovered from the silo. I was there when the workers, the sheriff, and a couple of his deputies laid Rick out on a tarp on the ground, and by all that's holy, I wish I hadn't seen it. You see, sometimes when you fall in a grain silo, you suffocate. Being compressed by grain does terrible things to the human body by itself, and Rick's face looked like it had taken a beating. But it wasn't the pressure of the grain that suffocated him, it was the grain itself. He drowned in it, slowly and painfully, inhaling grains of wheat after he'd sunk beneath the surface. You could tell by looking at him too, by the state of the body. Now, I don't want to be terrible by describing my uncle's body. Y'all can look up the Wikipedia page for grain entrapment if you want the specific details, but even still, let me tell you, it was absolutely and completely horrific to see. I had nightmares for months after as a kid, and from what I heard, so did other people too. I know that members of my family did. Life had to go on, and since we lived and worked on a grain farm, that meant the silos had to stay operational. I think everyone regarded them with a little more fear and suspicion from that day on. There had only been one other silo death on the farm, many years back in my grandparents' day, and one near-miss rescue when I was younger, but Rick's death hit different for a number of reasons. The main reason, though, was why Rick died. Remember Ella Beth said that she'd seen Rick climbing the grain silo at night? That turned out to be correct. Rick had died deep down in that grain silo. Within minutes, he would have sunk deep beneath the grain and then slowly suffocated over hours. There was no note, so we don't know for sure, but the way we figure, Rick did this to himself. He drove to the farm late at night, climbed up into the grain silo, and opted to step off the ledge and into the grain. Why? Who knows? People do funny things due to undiagnosed mental health issues. We suspect it was deliberate, though, because that's how Dad knew to call for help and mount the recovery mission. When Dad climbed up the ladder and into the hatch, he'd found Rick's boots, jacket, and watch neatly placed on one side of the ledge. the only indicator that someone was down there in the dark depths of the silo. I'm from Sweden, and until recently I helped run a small remote sheep farm. And without giving too many details to identify me, the farm I worked on reared sheep of a certain in-demand breed. Their wool is quite sought after, so even when this story occurred a few years back, the sheep were particularly valuable. The farm, being quite remote, meant we usually weren't bothered by people and could go about our business without much drama. What we weren't prepared for was a gang of organized criminals. They descended on our small family farm one day, looking to rob us of our livelihood. It's my family's farm and has been for many, many years. These days I no longer live or work there, but back then I had grown up around the farm. I went off to college in Malmö, and then came back and worked on the family farm for another 6 or so years until I eventually left. This incident occurred a few years before I left. The sheep were out grazing, and I was on shepherd duty that day, just me and one of the farm dogs, Bruno. It was quiet, an overcast afternoon with a bit of light rain drizzling down. Mostly I was just kind of killing time, waiting to load the sheep onto the truck and move them to the other field. I was scrolling through my phone, checking out whatever I was into back then, and at one point, I heard the sound of vehicles approaching. This was unusual. Nobody ever drove onto this part of the land except to help move the sheep. I was tucked under a tree, so I peered around and saw a truck pulling up to the gate. What was this, I thought? Nobody should have been coming onto this land like that. I crouched down and watched as a man exited the truck and opened the gate. The truck backed into the field and another man got out. Immediately, I knew what was going on. Sheep rustlers. You hear warnings about this sort of thing, but it always sounds like something out of a movie. It's never supposed to happen to you. This is present-day Sweden, not Wild West Red Dead Redemption America. Unfortunately for me, though, it was happening. And quickly, I grabbed Bruno's collar. I didn't want him to run out at the men and get himself hurt. Luckily, from where we were under the tree and in the bushes, we were pretty well hidden. The men hadn't seen us yet. They didn't appear to be looking around for a shepherd or anything. Normally, the sheep wouldn't be under constant watch, but that day I just happened to be preparing to move them to another field. We only had around 10 sheep in this herd at the time, but like I said, they were valuable. Still, I never imagined anyone would try to steal them, and certainly not like this. Now, I was pretty far away, but I thought that I recognized the truck as belonging to a pair of guys from the nearby town, cousins or something like that. They had a reputation for being troublemakers, always up to one scheme or another, and it seemed like their latest scheme was simple: steal our sheep and then profit, I guess. One thing I was certain of, there was no way that I was letting these idiots take our livelihood. Honestly, it was mostly because I was protective of the sheep and worried the guys would actually hurt them. I figured I was far enough away to make a phone call without them hearing me. They'd left the truck engine idling, which helped mask the sound. I quickly called up the farmhouse, told my family what was happening, and asked them to call the police. Then I hung up, not wanting to risk making more noise. I was already worried about Bruno deciding to bark at the men. And at that point, they were trying to catch one of the sheep. They didn't seem to have much of a plan, just chasing the sheep around trying to grab it. Maybe they only planned to steal one or two, and someone else might have just let it go, but not me. I wasn't letting a single sheep get harmed that day, and I honestly would fight them to the death if I had to. The problem was, I'm not some big, tough fighter type. I'm a fairly skinny guy, and I was pretty sure that I couldn't take one of them in a fight, let alone both. My only option was to convince them that I was more dangerous than they were. To do that, I had to stop worrying about Bruno getting hurt. I tied his leash around a low branch to keep him safely away from harm's way. I told Bruno to be a good boy and wait for me. Then I broke off another branch from the tree and made my move. I came charging out of the undergrowth, swinging the branch above my head, yelling every threat that I could think of. How I was going to effing kill them, how they'd wish their mothers never gave birth to them, all of this sort of crazy nonsense. And these cousins looked up, pretty startled and clearly spooked by my oncoming charge. And that's when one of them reached into a waistband of his pants and pulled out a pistol. Of course, I just froze in absolute terror. I hadn't even considered the possibility that these idiots might actually have a gun. I stopped in my tracks a few meters away and let the branch fall from my hands. And the cousins sort of just looked at each other, almost like, "What the F are you actually doing here?" They clearly hadn't thought their master plan through and definitely weren't expecting me. Their incompetence didn't matter much, though, when they were armed. They still had a major terrifying upper hand here. And the one with the gun kept it trained on me while the other came over and patted me down. Thankfully, I'd left my phone hidden with Bruno, and I hadn't thought about it much. I just didn't want it to get broken. And I was beginning to realize that I hadn't thought about anything really much at all. I guess in that sense, me and the cousins weren't that different really, and that thought sort of made me laugh in the moment. The cousin patting me down seemed unnerved by this and sort of stepped away, and we were at something of a stalemate. The gun-wielding cousin took control and roughly grabbed me, trying to force me to the ground. And that's when my survival instincts kicked in. Or maybe I lacked survival instincts. Either way, I charged the guy pointing the gun, who was so startled that he didn't react before I knocked him over, sending that gun bouncing across the ground. And that's when I realized that it actually felt suspiciously light. Was this idiot threatening me with some type of BB gun? Some type of toy? And I didn't have much time to think about it because then both cousins were on top of me, kicking, punching, flailing, and they were surprisingly bad at fighting for two actual criminals. Still, I'm pretty sure that they would have overpowered me if Bruno hadn't somehow pulled free and come charging across that field, barking and snarling like some maniac. And that was too much for them, I guess. They abandoned that fight and ran back to the truck. The engine was still running, so they just peeled away, thankfully without hitting Bruno or any of the sheep. Those cousins were apprehended and questioned by the cops later that day. There were all sorts of legal complications, and the whole thing was a mess. In the aftermath, I beat myself up harder than those cousins ever did. I still suffered nightmares and PTSD from my decision to just charge them and actually risk getting shot, even if it was probably just some BB gun. Facing down that danger, even for just a moment, stayed with me for years and eventually led me to leaving the farm for a much calmer and much more chill profession. This happened some years back. I used to walk my dog out in the Somerset countryside, where there are a lot of orchards. It's cider country after all. There was a large orchard near me where I'd take my Labrador Retriever as part of one of our regular walks. A public footpath ran through the orchard, so while it was privately owned property, like a lot of the Somerset countryside, it was okay to just wander around. This meant it was usually a pretty populated dog walking spot. I would often meet other walkers in and around those long, seemingly never-ending avenues of apple trees. Not always, though. Sometimes the orchard would be completely empty, especially on more dreary, overcast days. And that's what this day was like. Classic British weather. Cold and just a bit rainy. Usually on days like this, I wouldn't see many other dog walkers, and that day was no exception. So it was just me and Ben, my dog, strolling through the trees. The air was misted with this sort of rain, and the atmosphere was really breathtaking, even despite the crappy weather. Ben was running ahead through the lines of trees, and I saw movement and called out to him, just to keep him in sight. The movement I'd seen wasn't Ben, though. Ben came trotting out from behind me, emerging from the orchard. He wagged his tail, and I pet him. Movement up ahead amongst the trees, I saw. Was there another dog walker out? I couldn't explain why, but I was beginning to feel very unsettled. I never felt unsettled. I walked Ben almost most days, and sometimes in the dark. Maybe it was my own failing, but I never really got spooked. That day, though, something was giving me bad feelings. Up ahead, along the row of darkening apple trees, a figure stepped into the gap. He was quite some distance from me, but I could make out that it seemed to be a man in a long coat. Something about him made me feel even more uncomfortable. I couldn't put my finger on it as he stepped forward, and the man began walking toward me. There was something about his gait, something about his posture and the way that he walked that felt threatening. I pretended not to see him and decided to hurry away to the left. I clipped Ben's leash to his collar in case we needed to run. Now, glancing over my shoulder, I realized that I'd lost sight of the guy. Maybe he was just another walker and I had nothing to worry about. Something told me that that wasn't the case, though, and I began to hurry through the trees, Ben at my side. When the guy stepped out ahead of me, I had to stifle a very small scream, and I swear to God, it was like something out of a slasher movie. He just emerged from between the trees, except now he was much closer to me and coming from a different direction. He must have run through the orchard to get there ahead of me. I quickly changed direction, hurrying with Ben through the trees. I could just about see the edge of the orchard through the misty trunks, and I didn't want to lose sight of our goal. I also didn't want to get caught by my would-be stalker, so I began to speed up. So did he, behind me, and I could hear his footsteps now, jogging speed, and so I broke into a run, and so did he. The orchard's rows no longer seemed quite as straight or easy to navigate. As I ran, I briefly lost sight of the direction I knew the exit stile to be in. I didn't want to stop and I let the guy potentially catch me, but I needed my bearings. Whirling around, suddenly angry, I turned to face him. But the man was gone. No sign of him. I tried to peer through the trees looking for a shape, a shadow, anything. I crouched down hoping to see past the trunks of the short, squat apple trees. No sign of the guy. Ben took this as an opportunity to get excited and start trying to lick my face, and I had to fight to avoid getting distracted. I had to take the situation seriously, I felt. I managed to work out the direction we needed to head in and started to jog through the trees again. The fact that I'd lost sight of the stalker wasn't filling me with any confidence. I made it a few more meters when, sure enough, there he was again, moving to my right. This time, though, he caused me to stop in my tracks. Sometime during his last disappearance, the orchard stalker had removed his pants, and for want of a better word, he was letting it all hang free. Very gross. And that's when I recognized him. I'd seen this guy before while walking Ben around this area, and a few other dog walkers had pointed him out as acting strangely. There had also been recent talk of a flasher in the area, but it wasn't until now that the two things were connected. This guy was the local flasher, great, and now he was following me through the orchard. Ben began to growl, and I realized that if I was close enough to the flasher to recognize him, then he was close enough to catch up with me. He took a couple of tentative steps towards me, and I felt a genuine, icy terror coursing through my chest. This is back in the 2000s, too, and we didn't carry our mobile phones everywhere at all times, so I had my phone with me, but it was in my car. Well, that's fine, I told myself. I just need to get back to the car and call the police. The problem is, I needed to make it there before the flasher got to me. I had no idea what he'd do if he caught me, and I didn't want to find out. There was only one thing that I could do. Run. And so I did. With Ben at my side, I sprinted through the orchard. Thankfully, it wasn't harvesting time, so the ground wasn't lousy with fallen apples that could send me sprawling. And I did have to duck and dodge the occasional branch, though, especially since I wanted to put a lot of distance between myself and the flasher. When I finally reached the edge of the orchard, I had no idea if he'd been following me. I made for the stile and quickly climbed over, feeding Ben's leash through to the other side as he crawled under the planks. As I was climbing over, I could see that the flasher was still a ways into the orchard. He definitely followed me, but not too closely, and now he was standing there, pants off, just sort of blankly staring after me. And from there, it was a single open field back to the car. I got in and immediately called the cops. Unfortunately, in a small countryside town, they didn't have the resources to send someone down there right then as an emergency. And the officer I spoke to implied that there had been a number of reports of a flasher too, and they were looking into it. I guess they did in fact look into it, as sometime later I was called to identify my flasher and stalker in a lineup. I drove over to the neighboring town where the identity parade took place and picked the guy out. There was no mistaking him, although thankfully he wore pants that day. Unfortunately, not enough of the other women he'd also flashed were able to correctly pick him out in the identity parade, and charges couldn't be pursued at the time. Kind of a bummer, but what can you do? Thankfully, it seems like the threat of almost arrest was enough to stop the guy from going down to the dog walk and flashing women, at least for a while. I never saw him down there again, but I did see him around town on occasion. My son, who was at the town library one day, also saw him trying to leave the library suspiciously. He recognized the guy because I'd pointed him out to my son previously. The man was trying to steal books. He exited the library and the theft alarm went off. And so he reached into the huge backpack that he always carried, removed a few books and then threw them onto the desk and then just scurried off. Nobody even tried to challenge him, according to my son. This was nearly 20 years ago now, so who knows what this guy's up to, or even if he's still alive. I haven't seen him around town in a long time, and either way though, let's hope he gave up his life of crime or stuck to stealing library books instead of stalking and flashing women out at the park. Hey, Let's Read. I know you typically share stories about people, but sometimes God's other creatures can be absolutely terrifying. And one such story happened to me and my husband when we were vacationing on a farm a few years back. The land had a public path that ran through a number of fields. In past visits, these fields had been used to graze sheep, and this time, though, we were walking our 2 dogs along the river when we noticed that the sheep had been replaced with cows. They were quite some distance away on the other side of this huge field, and we really didn't pay any attention to them, and they paid no attention to us. We were just having a nice time. The dogs jumped in the river, they were fetching sticks and stones and all of that, and generally playing and having fun. And that's when my husband told me to look at the cows. They were all standing on high alert, sort of staring at us, this entire herd. I had no idea what in particular caught their attention, but something clearly did. Most of them looked kind of younger, these smaller cows, and I watched them for a moment staring at us, and then, when nothing happened, I went back to playing with the dogs. It must have been 10 or so minutes later when I glanced back at the cows and saw that they were now staring at us. Something about us had caused them to fixate. My husband suggested that we actually leave, and I decided he was probably right. We were about halfway down the field at this point with a river on one side. The gate leading into the next field was about 1/8 of a mile away. As we made the leave, the cows started to charge. All of them, all at once. The entire herd thundered across the field. We were still some distance away from them, so we had time to react, but my God, I had no idea that a herd of cows could be that fast. I guess I paused for a moment because that's when I realized that some of the cows were young, these male cows that haven't grown into full-blown bull status yet, so they don't really need separating. Now, these young bulls were clearly the ones spurring the rest of the cows on because they led the charge, and basically myself, my husband, and our 2 dogs were being charged down by a herd, or rather stampede, of young bulls. And that's when my husband told me to run. I pushed the dogs forward and we bolted. My goal was to get the youngest dog to safety, so I scooped her up in my arms. She was still a puppy and couldn't really run that fast. And then me and the 2 dogs ran for the gate. Meanwhile, my husband decided the best course of action was to try and bait the young bulls into following him. And so that's what he did. Almost like some prize-winning matador, he waved his arms, jumped up and down, and yelled at the cows to come get me. They started running toward him, which is when he realized the problem with drawing the attention of an entire herd of stampeding cattle. He was now being charged by those exact stampeding cattle. These cows then thundered across the field, and it was like that scene from The Lion King, if you remember that, except without the dramatic music or the lion. Just a horde of stampeding, snorting, angry cattle. And looking back, I can see the funny side, but at the time, I was just running, screaming, calling for help. I tripped and almost fell, making sure that I kept hold of the youngest dog as I stumbled. My husband wasn't as fast as I was, and he was hanging back a bit. I yelled at him to come on and hurry up. Now, by now, I'd reached the gate in safety. My older dog was looking between me and my husband, probably thinking, should we go back and save him? At the same time, my husband was keeping the attention of these stampeding young bulls by backing away toward the river, and he eventually had to wade in, and it wasn't until he was about waist-deep in the water that he managed to halt the cattle's advance. When they reached the riverbank, the cows sort of just changed their minds and began aimlessly ambling around. This allowed my husband to trek along the riverbank and out through the gate, joining us in safety. Now, this story might not be up there with stalkers or serial killers and all that kind of stuff that you usually get, but my God, let me tell you, in the moment, being charged down by an entire herd of stampeding cattle was one of the most terrifying moments of my entire life. It's easy to underestimate just how fast they are, and there were easily 30 or more cows in total in that herd. They could have trampled us to death with ease, and it's very easy to underestimate animals, especially if you live in the countryside and deal with farm animals regularly. Normally, they'll leave you alone, and a herd of standard cows likely would have, but those young bulls present in the field meant that they were angrier, more riled up, and more prone to being startled. And needless to say, we did not go walking in that field again while the cows were grazing anymore. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content either over on Patreon or click that big join button here on YouTube to hear about the extra perks for members of this channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.